The reason I'm wondering is PowerPoint does weird things to the screen. It didn't used to do that, but it does these days. And mostly these, I usually use Google Slides, but these are actual PowerPoint stuff. So I wanted to talk about objects, and this is actually getting closer to the core of what we're going to be doing, because we'll talk about object-oriented theory, and we'll talk about getting class diagrams, and also after we do class diagrams, we'll talk about how they relate to each other, because there are some different kinds of relationships that classes can have. So this is about objects. I'm not sure if this is the PowerPoint I want. Let's see what we got. Yeah, I think this will do. So originally, programming was always top to bottom. Does anybody ever do GW Basic or any of those early languages? Basically, you had in GW Basic, you started off, you had 32,000 lines to work with. That was the limit. And you just started at the top. There was no functions, there were no classes, there's no way to break it up. The lines were numbered, you just kept going down. That worked okay when things were simpler. Life was a lot simpler then. My first computer, I had DOS and BASIC. That was what came with it. And unless I wanted to have a $3,000 blinking cursor that did nothing, I had to learn some BASIC. So that was how programs were. Fortran was originally kind of like that, I believe. And does anybody do Fortran or COBOL?
I read the old Fortran books for amusement.
Okay, well that might help, but they're pretty much just top to bottom, right? There are some problems with that. There are a lot of problems with that. One is it's almost impossible to reuse code. One of the holy grails of programming has always been to be able to use code in a variety of places, so you can write it once and use it in many places. Traditionally, that hasn't happened very often. Another one is another problem with it is it was really hard to debug. Can you imagine 32,000 lines and trying to figure out where a problem occurred in that? And particularly, it got worse because in order to kind of reuse functions and things, they would insert go-tos. And you would go to a line number, and then you would do something, and then it would tell you to go back to where you were before. And they created what they called spaghetti code. It was impossible to figure out the logic almost of where things were going. Because things would come down for a while, they'd bump back up to a line, come down for a while, jump to another line. You know, it just was insane when you got into complicated things. So the next step was structured programming. And that is where you break your program into separate methods. C is like that. Pascal was a poster child for it. I'm not sure anybody ever used Pascal for real programming. It was used in schools a lot, right? It was as a kind of a pattern for structured programming. But I mean, somebody may have used it for real, but it was mostly an academic language. What they do is they break things into methods. All right. So each method does one thing, and then you call. That's my line. You call. You know, the methods, and you can. It does allow for some code reuse, in that you can reuse a method. It's easier to debug in that every method does one thing. So if something goes wrong, you can probably locate which method is it. The trouble with that is that, again, it worked really well when programs were simpler. And it's still, I mean, C is still what they write Linux in, right? You know, so it's not entirely gone. And in fact, it's pretty well incorporated into object-oriented programming too. But the problem was, if you had a program like Windows, where suddenly you had some 70,000 functions or more, keeping track of those functions, keeping track of how things, you know, related, making sure everything had different names. Every function had a unique name, and that every function did a unique thing. That got to be a real nightmare. It was just too complicated. So object-oriented programming came up as basically a way of organizing your methods into objects. And ideally, those objects would be related to things that that are native to the whatever you're working with. If you're doing a point of sale, there would be like the item from the inventory, and an inventory, which is a collection of items, right? And there would be the sale, which is all the things that are from the items that have been laddered up. And there might be a customer object, right? All these objects are kind of fairly natural to the subject matter that you're working with, whatever the application is supposed to be working with. And each class, each object, is basically stores all the methods that are appropriate to that object. So it gives you a bigger unit to play with. And ideally, a unit that is makes more sense overall, that's easier to conceptualize. In practice, it's not that simple, but that's sort of the theory. A lot of objects don't have any corresponding real-world object to go with, but that's sort of the idea. Does that make sense? There have been some things that have happened since then. I don't know if my slides have any of that. So there are service-oriented architecture. Have you guys heard of that? It's actually where things are more now than just object-oriented programming. So each level kind of incorporates the other. In the structured programming with the methods, you still had these, commands had to happen in the right order. That used to be the only thing. You have to do things in a certain order. In the objects, the methods are still ideally only relate to one thing. I would close that door, but we'll die. Actually, if there's nobody back there, do. There's class back there. So anyway, the objects incorporate the structured programming in that they still have methods, and every method should do one thing, right? Every function should do one thing. Service-oriented architecture is where you break a program into services, right? So, and each service does one thing, but it could consist of multiple objects. And applications become, and this is true especially in web development and app development, they become a collection of services. So you have a service that, say a web app, a service that connects to the Google Maps. And you have a service that connects to a database. And you have a service that connects to the location thing on your phone. Each of these is separate services, and your app just takes those services and adds them together into your own application, right? And you might have your own little bits too. But a lot of things, particularly web pages, become just conglomerations of services that that are being provided elsewhere. Data services, different kinds of functionality and services. And the advantage of that is that you can swap out services without totally taking down the application, right? You can swap your data service or something. This is where the idea of DevOps with literally continuous development. They build things into services, and then they swap out those services, constantly updating pieces, but never having to update the whole all at once. Windows, if you ever looked at Windows underneath, it is about 500 services. And those services, when they do updates, they add and remove from those. Okay, so that makes sense so far, sort of? All right, so what we're going to focus on are mostly the objects, and they're incorporated in, even if you do the service-oriented architecture, services consist of objects, right? So this is just some terminology. A class is a description of an object. So when we write a class, which we'll do a little bit, I'll just show you. It's basically what, if you write a class called customer, it's basically a description of what a typical customer would have, right? When you instantiate it, when you make it an instance, then it might be George or Ruth or whoever. I mean, it'll be a particular customer when it's instantiated. But the class itself is about a typical abstraction of a customer. Does that make sense? The class is basically what the code is. We were talking about, if you were in the 172, we were doing that. In most object-oriented languages, when you make a class, an instance of a class, you use the new keyword. This isn't true in Python, but it's true in most other languages like Java and C# and etc. The new basically tells it, make room for this in memory. When you're compiling it, it says, we're making an instance of this type, make room for this type in the RAM when you're, in the memory allocations. Not that you need to worry about that, but it won't work without the new keyword. So this is about the code part. We'll talk about the diagram, I guess. It actually has the diagrams too, but a class diagram is a diagram that describes what this class is going to look like, and they're really close to the code. And they can be made, if you get really precise about them, they can be very, very clear about what the code is going to look like. And in fact, in Visual Studio and in a lot of programs, I don't think Eclipse will do it, but some IDEs for Java will do it. You can draw the picture and it'll write the code. And you can write the code and it'll draw the picture. I mean, they're really closely related. Typically, when you ship your code overseas, you send them a class diagram with some descriptions, maybe some other diagrams too. So the class diagram has basically three areas. It has the name, which is up at the top. I have a picture in a moment. It has the fields. Fields are class level variables. Does that mean anything to anybody? Does it not mean anything to anybody? Class level means that they're declared, so it's a matter of scope. The quickest way to understand it is class variables are variables that describe the class itself. So if you have a customer, a field would be something like customer name, customer number, customer address, things like that. Mm-hmm. They're similar to like database fields, but they don't perform quite the same. And then methods are the things that a class can do. So maybe a customer can add items to their discount list, right? So that might be something a customer can do. So this is a point of sale class. I don't vouch that these are the best of all classes, but this has some of the things in it. It has these are the fields, right? So this is the title, point of sale. You can name it whatever you want. These are the fields, and the minus means, anybody know what the minus means? Private. Yeah, they're all private. The data type with the colon there is optional. You don't have to put the data types into the class diagram. But I did. So this is a data type. This is a list that contains item as a type. And then station ID is an int. The pluses mean public. Those are methods. Not every method has to be public. And again, these have more detail than you might necessarily have. This has the return type. So date, void, int, void, decimal. And it also puts in the parameters. Sometimes you just put in the functions without too much detail. But again, if you want people to code off of them, and if you want to generate code from them, then you should put in these, the actual parameters and whether it's public or private and all of that. So I said it can all be in Visual Studio. You can draw the picture and it will generate the code. And there's a lot of IDEs that will do that. Oh, I see what you knew. It says right there, minus and plus. Any questions on that? We're going to be doing them, but we'll talk about them first a bit. If we don't melt first. It's going up slowly. All right. So one of the reasons, let's go back. Fields like this are usually private. to the class. Though there might be, and I did not show those here, but there might be a get or a set to reveal them. You guys, how many have worked with getters and setters? And a few of you, not many. So there's a principle, which we'll talk about these principles after a bit, called encapsulation. The idea is that a class should be self-contained as much as possible, and that you shouldn't have to make changes to that class if you make changes to another class. Does that make sense? So you should keep the members of a class as private and self-contained as possible, and you should control the access. And you control the access to these private members by means of methods called getters and setters. And they don't, I didn't list them here because they're just sort of assumed to some extent, but you could list them there. The other idea, I mean, the ideal for a class with encapsulation, and we'll talk about this a bit more later, is that it should be like Legos. Or maybe a more realistic example, like the hardware in your computer. It's just a solid state thing. You pull it out, you plug another one in. You know, that's the idea of a class, is it should be just like a video card or something. You just pull one out when you don't want an improvement, you put another one in. It just automatically, everything connects, it works. Have you ever done hardware? Yeah, I've done some. I mean, you can't put a video card in the wrong place. There's only one place that'll take that plug. Now, you can try. You can break it, I suppose. But there's only one place where you can plug it in. Same with almost every component in the hardware. It's these days, that's one reason why there aren't very many jobs for hardware work in computers, because it's basically pull one board out and put another board in. The only hard part, at least for me, with my fingers, is like some of the little cables, particularly the LCD cable.
Versus the motherboard cables.
Yeah, some of those are really hard to connect. The other thing is compatibility. You have to know everything's compatible. But, I mean, it's basically plug and play, and that's what ideally classes are. If you create the perfect customer class or the perfect point of sale class, and I'm not saying that is, you should be able to plug it in for any application where there's a point of sale. I mean, you shouldn't have to make any changes to it. You just say, oh, this is an instance that has a point of sale. I'll just put the class in there. That's the ideal. Doesn't happen that way very often, but that's the ideal. It should just, you know, they should be just point. And the encapsulation and the idea of these being private is sort of a part of that idea. It will not object if you make them public, but it means you have no control over when those things are accessed. Public means that other classes can access those things. These, because they're public methods, any other class can call them, right? Not all, I mean, you can make them private if you want them to be just local. But does that make some sense? So this is sort of what this says. The idea is that class elements should be internal. One of the things, too, is you don't have to do a get and set for every field. If you want to only see it, you can do just gets. Gets let you see the value. If you want to only change it, you can do sets without gets. Like a password would allow you to change it but not be able to see it if you didn't have a get. So I mean, you don't have to do all of those. Technically, you might see these terms sometimes. Gets are called accessors. Have you ever seen those terminology? So an accessor is basically something that allows you to access the underlying value. Mutators are things that allow you to change the underlying value, so those would be the sets. Again, I'm not going to hold you to a lot of that, but sometimes when you look in a book that talks about it, and I know when I was looking at this years ago and I saw accessors and mutators, I had no idea what they were talking about. All right. So encode classes contain the same elements as a class diagram, but they can also contain a couple of other things. One of the things they can have constructors. Do you guys know what constructors are? I know a couple of you know. Constructors initialize the class. Basically, what that means is that when you call the class, the constructor runs, one of the constructors runs anyway, because you can have multiple constructors. And it will initialize the variables and set everything up. I've had them sometimes where the constructor calls a method too. Like if it needs to connect to the database, you might do that connection in the constructor for the class so that the connection occurs as the class comes into work. So constructors initialize the class, and they can have multiple constructors. We'll talk about that later. Something we probably won't look at much, but they can also have events. If you have a class that reacts to a mouse click or enter button or things like that, you can create an event. Java does this easier than C#, I think, actually. It does it differently anyway. C# uses, this is totally irrelevant, C# uses delegates, and Java tends to use classes that implement interfaces. So here's an example of a class. I think I did this in Java, I think. It's a deck of cards. So it has an array list of cards. And one of the things that I did in the constructor is I populated the deck of, this one creates a new array list of cards, and it calls the populate the deck method. And then what does this one do? This one just takes in an array list of cards already done, right, rather than populate the deck. Basically, this goes through, don't worry about it, but basically it loops through and creates a card, all the numbers for all the suits. I've used this. Again, once you've done this deck and card classes, you can use it for any card game that uses a traditional deck. Right? It looks weird, it looks alien if you haven't coded much, but it actually is fine. This is an array of suits. I'm going through and I'm doing 14 cards per deck, and I'm just giving them a numeric, and I'm doing it for each suit, right? Each suit will have 14 cards. You could do more sophisticated, you could add pictures and things, but we won't worry about that right now. Does that make kind of sense? So this is a class, these are the constructors, this is a private method, this is a public method. The public method just returns the deck. Just gives, which is just an array of cards, just returns the list of cards. So this is the card, and basically what I did, and this is Java again. Get the suit, set the suit, set number, get number. Those are sets and gets, right? Just returns the number. This one says that the number is going to be equal to whatever number they pass in. Return the suit. This suit will be whatever they pass in. If you've done C#, you know that it really looks about the same. C# or Java. It's not much difference between them. There are differences. There are things that can drive you nuts because they're just tiny differences. And we're not going to do a lot of coding. I'm just trying to show you some coding examples. Okay, so that's the end of that slideshow. Maybe instead of doing another one of these, since it's so hot and it'll put you to sleep, let's do some classes. So there are some other rules about classes, which I'll talk about maybe a little later, in that they should be, let me fix this too. This is what PowerPoint does to you. It extends your screen, so I'm not seeing the come back. Why isn't it duplicate? I have a black screen for myself too. we go. All right, so I'm going to do Visio, and we'll just play a little bit with this. We may take a break. I know I'm not going to give any breaks, but as it gets closer to 80, I think we'll need one. So in Visio, again, if you go to software, it's the easiest way. And you'll see UML class. And that's what we will do is the UML class. Right now, we're just going to worry about, we're not going to worry about the connections between classes. We're just going to kind of worry about what the classes would be and what kinds of things they might contain. So I'll zoom up for a moment. Just to look at the tool set. We're going to mostly, as I say, do classes. They have some things in here, like if you need to add a member or a separator. There's usually a separator between the, like the fields and the methods. There's some packages. Packages are like groups of classes that are going to be installed together. We're going to pretty well ignore that. There's some notes. We might do some notes. These are the relationships, but we're not going to deal with them now. We will later. And actually, only these four are legal relationships in most of the world. They add a few things. We will talk about interfaces. They use them a lot. Oh, that's okay. They use them a lot in most object-oriented languages. As far as I can find, Python doesn't have interfaces. I suppose you could fake them. All right. So let's do like we talked about the kiosk, and then I'll do the show tracker thing too. But if you think about a kiosk in a store, what kinds of objects would there be? Let's just do a couple of them, and then we'll. Actually, I'm going to kill this zoom and just zoom up on the document. What kinds of things, when you go like through a QFC down here and you go through the self-checkout, what kinds of things do you think would be objects there? Just think about naturally kind of what's involved. What?
Menu.
Menu? Oh.
Card reader.
The what?
Card reader. Card
reader could be one. The menu, there is a whole set of things that would be related to the views. I'm going to add fields to these later. So if you're going to have a card reader, there's probably a card. The kiosk, would that be an object, or would you think of it as a set of objects? So I'm trying to think of what the objects would be. One of the things is a what?
Weighing machine.
Yeah, I was just going to put a scale. They have a scale. They have a scanner. This would relate to the views, and I'm not sure what I want to say. Monitor?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And the monitor, we're going to, Is that how you spell monitor? Looks wrong.
OR.
OR. That looks better. We're going to kind of ignore it because there's a whole, every little view inside of that monitor would be another class.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to kind of just ignore those for right now. But there's usually a whole set of display classes. These are what are called domain classes. Classes that have to do with the main process. There's also, what other kinds of things? And we'll fill some of these out. We're not going to worry about how they relate to each other yet. We could name it product. I tend to name it item, but product would work. Product is fine. I'm going to just inventory, which will probably be a collection of products. Is there anything else? And then, as I said, we can maybe fill these out. And then maybe we'll take a break in a minute. I need air if you guys don't.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you can think of in this sweltering heat? You could maybe do a printer, or maybe what we should say, like a receipt. You could possibly think of printer too.
Yeah, actually, there's like.
There's also coupon. We could actually make an object for coupon. Oh, not in enumeration. I should talk about enums too, but not now. Class. And I mean, if we're thinking about objects, you can see that objects can get quite complicated too, because there can be a lot of them. I'm going to do employee in the sense that they have an override and a help function. And then the last thing I'm going to do is message, which, because there'll be messages that pass like from the kiosk to the employee. Like when you scan alcohol, it says basically they have to come and validate you. All right. Just to let you know, that's probably more classes than any of the assignments we'll have. And I often do this this way. So what I'm going to do is we're going to fill out some of these. I don't know if we'll fill out all of them with fields and methods. But I often start by just figuring out what are the kinds of objects that are involved. Does it make sense? All of these are fairly natural when you think about the self-checkout. They all kind of flow into that, don't they? Or do they not? I mean, the idea of object-oriented programming is that at least at the core, the objects should reflect what you're doing. Now, as I said, there's a whole bunch of other objects that can come out of this that we aren't going to deal with right now. The domain objects are the ones that reflect the actual business model that you're doing there. And then there could be objects that relate to how it interacts with the database. There could be objects that are basically provide a transition to the ATM system. Because the ATM system is probably not entirely theirs, right? It goes to the banks and things like that. And then there's there's a system of views, right? And then there might be all sorts of helper classes that do bizarre little things. As I said, it can get really complicated. But the core idea is that it should reflect what the basic idea. Card is basically kind of what we're doing instead of a person, I think. Because in terms of the system, they don't care who you are, but they do care if you have a card, right? What would be some of the fields in the card? Some kind of, card number or ID.
Is that like a debit card or a loyalty card?
I'm thinking loyalty card.
Like phone number?
it probably does have a phone number.
It's a story, a store with workers, something like that.
Or what?
It's a store with workers.
I'm not sure. Actually, does anybody know what's on a grocery card? I doubt if it has much more than the card number and a phone number.
It's
Barcode.
Well, the barcode would be the card number.
it doesn't have phone number. When I program my car, I always put my phone.
You can do the card number. I don't know if it's on the card. It probably is.
The card number.
The card number is on the card. So there's two different kinds of cards in the world. There are smart cards and there are dumb cards. A dumb card, I mean, all they need is the card number. If you don't have the card number, you can enter your phone number, but it may not be the number that's on your card, because I haven't entered usually when I enter the phone number, I don't have my card, right?
Yeah.
So it's coming from the database. It's not coming from the card. I suspect that the only thing on the card is the card number, and then it is associated with you in the database from when you first registered.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Most and farm policy.
So a smart card would be like your Orca card. Your Orca card it keeps a list of all your recent trips. It has a purse. So if mine doesn't, because it's a pass. They're different kinds, but if most of them have a purse on it, which tells how much money you have left, and it subtracts it every time, which means that I'm not sure actually if the subtraction is done by the kiosk on the card, or if
When you
it's
tap it,
it's when you tap it, it removes it. So
The balance.
it's got to be in the
it shows a balance.
that program must be on the card to some extent. It's hard to say.
The program supposed in the machine.
Maybe.
It probably has something to do with the reader.
It does need to know which reader it is.
Because it reads the infrared.
Yeah.
The card is not in the program.
So anyway, it's a smart card in that it has a lot more on it than just a number, right? But I think most of the cards just have a number on it. If they have a chip, they might have more. Although a chip is, I think, supposed to help with the encryption.
Yeah, the card with the
But I suspect there's just a card number. And the card number in the database is associated with a person. So I don't think it has any methods, anything it can do. It's just a card number. It's relevant here, even though it's this minor, because it's part of the whole system. Now, it probably has, if you were doing it as a class. So I removed my member. So let's add the member. I just want to move it up there. Okay. So it probably has like a get and a set if you were writing it as a class. So you could do like get number. And that would be like a plus. And if we wanted to do, I'll do just actually this. I'll just add a member down below it. And it probably has a set. I think there's a hidden member in there, but actually probably not a set, because you're never going to change that number, right? So it's probably just a get.
What about for the pen or a signature?
You don't really have that though with a grocery card. I suspect the average bank card's a little smarter. It probably has more information on it.
I'll call again.
Although I don't know for sure, because it could, I mean, the number might be enough to. So it's got to have the number, and it's also probably got the bank, you know, code, whatever the code is that identifies the bank. Because when you go to somebody else's cash machine, it knows where to go. So it must have the account number.
I know the first four distinguishes what type of card, like MasterCard or Visa, and then I think the next 4 or 8 is for the bank.
Yeah, so it has to identify those things. But this one, really, all it has to do is get the number and match it to the database. All right, so we'll do that. So if we do a card reader, it's going to, it may not have any, I'm not sure what fields it would have. Do you guys think of any fields? We'll do just a few of these, and then it'll take a quick break. It may take a couple of breaks.
String integer.
Well,
Get number.
well, it will have a method, right? So one of the things it will do, and it will definitely have to get the card number. So I want to say, let's just say read card number, because it's going to get it from the card. It'll basically call. It'll call the get card method, right? And then what will it do? So it has to call the database, right? Or check. We could, what do you want to call it? Validate?
Yeah.
And then it might, so when it validates the number, it could return, well, I'm trying to think of what if it would return the person information. I don't think it actually ever does it?
It should return the expiration date, so it's valid or not.
Yeah, if it's valid, I mean, within the valid method, it could do a couple of things, like make sure that they're in the database, make sure that the dates are valid. But would they even know, I mean, do they ever expire?
Or not really.
It does for credit cards and things, but for the store cards, what? You know, it could return points if depending on how they do that.
Oh yeah. I remember that when you lost your car and you apply a new car and you find the old car again and use it again, that's it. It's fine.
I'll say get points.
What I mean is that when you lost,
Because it does bring back like your gas points or your at Fred Meyer, which is where I usually shop, just because of where it is on the highway on the way home. So they give you your gas points. So and then they also have reward points. So I'm not going to differentiate those here, but not necessarily, because they actually give you cash back as well as gas points. No, just if you have a grocery cart. Fred Meyer does. They give you dollars back. It's not a lot. You spend $500, you get $10 back or something.
Yeah.
Fred Meyer's closest store for me. That's a thing. So.
Even QFC does that.
Yeah, and then the gas. You get 10 cents off for every 100 points, and you get a point per dollar for most things except for alcohol. There's certain things that don't count. Now, is the card reader different than the? Oh, the scanner scans food, right?
Scanner, slider, chip, or keypad.
I'm not going to do all these, but we'll do a couple of them just to get the idea of them, which I think we're doing. So actually, maybe we should do like product. Scanner could be a little difficult. One of the things with the scanner is it has to determine, it scans the barcode if they've got a barcode, but if it doesn't have a barcode, then it has to have methods for entering the
Searching item.
number.
Searching item by name.
Yeah. So there's all those different things. So let's do so a product would have for fields.
One membership is the cap.
Yeah, it would have a product name.
Is there item number?
Yeah, it'd have some kind of what's it? Just universal price code or something. Some kind of number. Yeah, let's just say product code. That could be anything. A lot of stores, so some things are like if you buy things from Cisco, I don't know that stores do. Restaurants do. I don't know if stores do. They'll have a Cisco barcode, but if you resale them, they typically put their own barcode over it.
Doesn't it have to be registered though, for the individual item?
Well,
Because if you like Google that UPC code, it'll pull up that exact item.
right. So probably both. I mean, a lot of stores do sell by the UPC code, but a lot of time it depends on the product. Sometimes they put their own barcode over it.
If it doesn't save or something.
Yeah, I mean, well, the inventory should keep track of that, which is a big pain trying to keep all the prices up. So we got the product code. What else would we know about the product? Price is one of those, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's actually a good thing to know. So you don't have to do, I'm gonna do price, expiration date, which is not how you spell that. And I keep wanting to do a double dash.
So those are minus, just unpublic.
Yeah, they're private. And actually, so I'm going to do this because you can't have spaces in actual variable names. Also, I'm being really inconsistent in between capitals and not. There are usually naming code conventions depending on the language that you're doing. What else might there be on a product? And then product, I think, is the last one we're going to do before we take a breather and get error in here.
Size.
Would be weight
Weight would be one.
or amount of pieces of the clothing.
So
itself.
let's put this as
You
like
want
unit type. What?
All undersized.
You could, except that, so some things are sold by piece and some things are sold by volume. Yeah. That's why I was thinking unit type. And I keep doing double dashes, and that is because I have been doing tons of SQL. And that is a comment in SQL.
What about the item that has these permission?
Right, so I was trying to think of what we want to name that. Restriction or...
Like something alcohol, it will have to be.
We could do restriction. Well, so alcohol, you have to be 21. Sudafed, they kind of come and check you. Actually, these days, Sudafed is under lock and key mostly.
Isn't it only
What was that?
a certain amount of things that they do that, or a combination of items?
Well, so typically Sudafed is under lock and key because people just stole it. It's a major ingredient in methamphetamine.
How about some kind of others?
Kind of what?
Like, let's say if it's a meat that it was already inspected, if there's a number, inspection number.
Maybe. But I think one of the things that, and we would talk about this maybe later on inheritance, not everything is going to have that. So you might want to make a child a product called meats. And you might have a child called produce or something. Does that make sense?
Some kind of standard, like clothing needs to have some kind of standards, like, there is no FDA produce which should not be in the clothing cosmetics.
I'm not sure if you need to put that into the point of sale, but it might be in the database. You're right, it might be in the product thing. This could be really complicated in the database because there are, and we haven't talked about inheritance, we will, but a product is one that could easily branch off into child classes, one for produce, maybe one for clothes. Because the thing is that they all have unique requirements. They're all products that you could sell like at a Fred Meyer, because they sell everything. They're like Walmart or something. So that they could, there's all sorts of different kinds of products. They all have different specs and different requirements. So the things that would be common if we were to do that as a parent, I don't know, restriction, maybe. I mean, you might want to just separate alcohol as a child too, I don't know. Alcohol is the main restriction, alcohol and tobacco. Typically at like a kiosk, you can't you have to go to somebody to get tobacco. A lot of times you have to go to somebody to get Sudafed these days, particularly down south in Pierce County, which is the methamphetamine capital of the state, I think. What? Oh, it's getting down there. There's a lot of meth labs out in the woods around Mount Rainier, actually. Is there any methods that would go with product? It is possible for a class to have no methods and only fields. It's also possible for a class to have only methods, like a card reader, and no fields. It's possible to have, you don't have to have both. A lot of classes are basically what they call data classes, and product could be one of those, that essentially just store a bundle of data that could be moved as one thing, right? You can move a product. We'll talk, I might save this because this is actually a really good instance for where we could do inheritance later.
We need to have get and set methods for that.
You probably would have get and set methods for each of those. Depending on how thorough you are, so I often don't list the get and sets because I assume that they're assumed. But if you're not being assumed, particularly if some of them might be only private, you could list out all the gets and sets that you're going to use. So yeah, you could have gets and sets for each of those, and then you'd have a fair number of methods. Yeah. Just there's no methods that are particular other than, revealing the fields. I have seen people that are really lazy. We just made all these private or public, but that's not a good plan generally. All right, we are 1/10 of a degree away from 80, so I think if you guys want a quick break to get some air. To me, it's sweltering in here. So, yeah, let's take a quick break, and then what we'll do is I'll save this, particularly the product one, and we'll go and do the one that's closer to the assignments, and then we'll talk about what the actual assignment would be. And then you guys can take off if you want, because although it might be worse Thursday, I don't know.
It's supposed to be like the mid-80s.
Nah, depends on where you live. It's supposed to be in the high 70s here.
I live like 2 miles north of Whiskey. That's what it said. It keeps like changing and getting higher and higher. Okay, not tomorrow, Thursday. Yeah. And that's for here.
That isn't what they were saying earlier. It must have.
Yeah, it keeps increasing like every few hours.
I just finished. Oh, you're not in this section.
No.
I wish this class had windows so you could like breathe better.
Mine still says 78 for Thursday.
Maps, trees.
So it's probably in the vicinity.
Yeah.
Hi, Steve.
Yeah.
So what's your opinion for what kind of free hosting source?
I don't know of one that's free. That will
Oh,
do
cheaper,
anything.
how about that?
What?
Cheaper. Besides Azure.
And you want it to be Windows to do?
I want to do Windows C# so can I do have a Dream host, but I want to use.
DreamHost won't work.
Yeah, see.
The way I would see it,
Free host 2018. It's a free website hosting for C#.
Does it say for C#?
It does. No, for does not say for C# or NVT.
DreamHost is a Linux machine. They'll give you MySQL and they'll give you PHP.
Forum. There's a forum there. I want to host my C# ASP.NET website. I have create some stuff. Create not really good.
I don't think GoDaddy will do it either. This is just doing web hosts and they're not Windows hosting companies.
Yeah.
But I don't think any of them will be free.
So you say yours $100, anyway, a bit more than $100 for a year, right?
It's 180 a year for me.
For a year, like $20 for no, $15 a month.
Yeah, about. But I'm not using SQL Server on that.
Oh, I'm gonna lower costs. I cannot figure out how to do any volunteer work or donation anyway. Since my son's in it.
Yeah, I just wanted to show it to you because.
So most Windows hosts cost money because Microsoft charges for their tool.
And the more secure than.
Yeah.
They can be. They don't necessarily. You can write a really insecure Windows program.
Well, we make me feel like a harder than.
So the easiest and best place to host it is Azure, but you need to check because I'm pretty sure that they will not. They might give a discount for an educational institution, but they're not going to make it free.
Or they say free for stuff. I do 1 year, the next year. They still take my.
They still won't let you do it for a business for free. As a student or just learning it, yes.
Yeah.
That's not free. So they take my trying to get my credit card information. I didn't.
Right, and if you go over the amount, now I don't know, Windows, Azure usually doesn't charge you if you go over the amount. They just cut you off, but Amazon Web Services will cut you off. It will charge you.
So, oh yeah, I'm talking about Amazon Web Service. How it
So if you do like Postgres and The Windows stuff costs money. It costs a lot of money on Amazon.
Then Amazon cheaper.
No, not really.
Why, how Amazon hosting do for C#?
Yeah.
It will, but you can host it on Amazon. But if you're using the Microsoft tools and if you're using SQL Server, it will cost money. What? You can use SQL Express. SQL Express is free. But if you need more than SQL Express,
Well, actually,
costs
I
money.
do have a SQL Express when I put demo from Jim's Farm.
Well,
Jim's Farm, right?
but is that available from anywhere?
I don't think so.
Are you looking for web hosting?
Yeah.
My web tech professor said that it's $5 a month for, huh?
Well, it's,
That's the $5 a month.
With the your.edu.
that Jim host we talk about now.
Oh, no, that's
Not
not
gonna
it.
the host
Yeah,
for.
DreamHost won't do.
Oh, DreamHost, yeah.
Yeah, DreamHost won't do it because they're Linux only. DreamHost does Linux only. So they'll do PHP, MySQL,
Yeah,
Apache,
yeah.
those standard things they do for free. But there's no Windows hosting at all.
So do you think should I build an app with PHP, with cheaper hosting?
Yeah, let me
I'm
look
gonna
at what you
expense,
posted.
I'm gonna learn that.
I want to know this has to be WAMP.
It does on Dream. No, it's not Windows. It's
I
it's
mean, for
a,
what you need.
no, you don't need WAMP. WAMP won't do it either. WAMP is still PHP and Apache. You need IIS. You need Windows Server IIS. And that costs money because it costs the company money.
When it used as a personal purpose, like, even though I don't
Were you
know-
going to, so if you do it for yourself only, right, but you were talking about using it for the
Yeah,
school.
the school, but since, no, I don't get fund yet.
Yeah, so if you do it for yourself only, you might be able to get away with it for free because of the EDU. You can get a year of hosting from Azure for free as long as you're not using it for any kind of commercial purpose and you are in school. Right?
How do they detect when I use a commercial or individual? What's standard one?
They can tell by the traffic for one thing.
Oh, so if somebody log in my app,
So you can have a few people log in, but if you suddenly had a large volume of people logging in, then they would expect it, and they could either come after you for money or they could shut it down.
find me. Well, you know what? When I learn the class, then I never launch anything. Right, just the local hosting, local data express.
So this one, Windows servers has HostGator, Liquid Web, HostWinds.
Are you on the free?
No, none of these are free. GoDaddy looks like does have some Windows servers,
I had a Windows server with them.
but DreamHost does
No, I
not.
think it's really important. I might be able
I wonder if anyone has Apple servers.
Why?
Servers existed in some company.
I don't know. Is there such a thing as this?
Yeah.
What would be an Apple server? I don't think there's such a thing.
If you go to Apple website, you can find their servers. They can purchase your app.
Huh.
We're talking about services or the actual services.
No, the actual like hardware server.
They still make those.
Yeah.
I wonder why anyone would use one.
Well, what about just make it like a phone app?
What?
Google app. Not Windows. Since everybody uses a phone.
I have to double check now.
Because I remember when we had an interconnection, people would come in asking about gold, Apple servers and be like, hey, do you have any parts for that? Use an app.
Are we mostly bad?
You get break. You get break.
One thing I am missing.
That's significantly cooler.
So that's something I really,
They have Mac OS server.
like a website like.
I suppose if you were,
Well, let's see, I remember seeing it on a Mac Mini.
all right.
Mac Mini they had it.
You know, the video's been running this whole time. I may try to cut out this section.
OS X server.
So I'm going to start in just a minute, and we'll do the show tracker. We'll talk about what would be involved with that, and then we'll talk about what the class exam, the assignment would be like for you guys. And then we're going to build on the class. Like today, we're just going to talk about classes. Next time, maybe next week, we'll talk about the relationships between classes. And then I'm going to show you some coding examples of the classes too as we go forward. So we'll get a lot of that.
I know.
Most are here.
It's kind of hard to.
And I really hope that they figure this room out before Thursday. I don't think they will. It actually dropped a degree. It was 79. Well, it was 79.1. Now it's 79.0. Yeah, it just went up again. All right. It's probably me talking.
Yeah, there you go.
So let's do show tracker. And what we just think about what classes would go in that. I'm going to do a quick text at the top to title it. What classes would go in show tracker? We'll do that and then we'll call it. So remember, this is basically it would be a program to track shows and venues and artists and things occurring around town. So what was it? So show would probably be one of the objects, right? Venue would be an object. A lot of times the database gives you a clue, but objects are usually not identical to the database things. Probably artist. What else might there be? Client or fan? What do you want to call them? What? Fan? Is there anything else?
Administration. Or the owners. Management.
Yeah, would they be anything? Well, so those would be in the show when we start talking about the fields in the show. Let's I don't know the administration. I mean, the fact that you use it doesn't necessarily mean that there's a class for it. Does that make sense? Let's go through show and add a few things. What would be in show for fields? You had a couple.
Yeah, dates and price.
Date is actually a terrible field name. It's a reserved word in almost every language.
Time.
Yeah, time, price. What else?
Show name.
Actually, yeah. So let's do. I'm putting square brackets there because I think there could be an array of artists.
Venue?
Probably venue, and I heard something else too.
Show name.
Show name. Anything else? So we got the date, the time, the price, the artist, the venues, the show name. I'm going to add description. Would there be any kind of restrictions be on the show or only on the venue?
I think you could have age restrictions.
Yeah, venue.
I think it can be on the show. Then you can do either way. Yeah.
Restrictions could be like,
PG-18.
yeah, it could be the based on the content of the show, or it could be based on that they're serving alcohol.
Underage shows first, then.
Yeah, that's a possibility too. Yeah. Anything else? So one of the things you can do with these, if you want, what?
So the from Thai like a cartoon or action. Or
I'm just thinking music, but we could do genre. I mean, I'm thinking music is all of. Actually, if we're to do reviews, so that would be another object, right? So I'll do genre. I'm gonna add. I'll add review.
What about the ticket?
My original description of this said that we weren't going to handle tickets other than to say where they could be achieved.
Right.
Yeah. But that actually could be a field here. Basically where are the tickets?
Length.
What?
A movie length. How long?
How duration.
Do they even know that ahead of time? What?
They set times.
We have time.
It's show time.
Right. So, yeah, we could do. I wonder if we should do.
I don't know. 3 hours or 1 hour.
Maybe methods, like being delayed or something,
What do you mean? I didn't hear.
like in methods,
Metals?
yeah, for the show as an object. And
Metal. I'm not sure. Tell me.
then, I was thinking that maybe here under on the next one, you have the things they can do, to show, be delayed.
You could do a delay. I'm not sure if you do it in this program. I suppose you could. You could. So one of the things you could do. I'm going to make an announcement class, which would be for things like delays. That's not how you spell announcement.
Schedule change. Just an E after C.
Yeah.
Delay or schedule change.
Well, I'm just going to do. And it would be, so they could do like changes in price, announce that it's full, so there could be an array of that. I put an array of times. I'm not sure that that's a good solution to the fact that different artists have different times. Maybe we'll have to think about that one. And these things can take a lot of thought. You know, we're kind of doing this off the top of our heads, but actually when you really work these things through, you probably need a lot to really think them through. The other thing that I want to mention is that these could be, you can actually assign data types in here if you want. I'm thinking if we do an array of times, it's probably not simple time.
Usually they have like a door time.
The takes and the
Ends at this time.
Yeah,
Start time.
where it gets complicated is if you decide your venue is something like Seattle's center and it's Bumbershoot. Then you have a really complicated set of times and places. But you could do a whole bunch of shows in a venue, right? So each show could be different with a different time. I guess you could do it that way. So I'm just going to do time. Maybe we still have to think about that one a little. Price would probably be something like decimal. As I said, this actually, so artists I think would be type artist. Venue would probably have the type venue, right? Show name would be just a string.
it has to be uppercase.
It depends on what you did. Depends on the language you're thinking of, and it depends on your naming conventions. I am nothing if not inconsistent. So, and I've used, you know, the naming conventions between C# and Java are different, and I confuse them a lot when I'm typing things like this. So, like, string is capital in Java, and it's lowercase in C#. Restrictions would probably be just, I think it would be just a string. I was thinking you could maybe do a Boolean, but I don't think you could because you need to know what kind of restriction. Most of these are string. And this one would be an array of announcement objects. Again, I may not do all of these, but let's think of some methods.
Also,
What?
can show get cancelled.
You could cancel. I think that might just go into announcement. But one of the things would be to, I'm just going to call it create announcements. Create announcement. Here's another thing that I find really difficult when you're doing this, and I have an extra N in there. Actually, are there two N's in announcement? I still am.
Yeah.
Different announcement post, the create announcements, right?
And if you wanted to return type to this, it would return an announcement.
So no minus, no plus.
It has a plus.
The announcement.
The one above it.
Well, just generally fields are meant to be announced, private. You can create an announcement. I would think that you could like add artist. And it would probably be void. Now, I was using the naming convention for Java up above, but I'm now using C# naming conventions. Okay. I'm not sure it matters a whole lot, but void means that it doesn't return anything.
for announcements? Because are you providing methods?
No, I'm adding the methods for show.
Okay, so you're just adding all the methods and all the classes in one thing?
Well, no, this is just for show.
Yeah.
But for the show can have a collection of announcements, but the announcement is a separate object. And a show can have a list of artists, if the artist is a separate object.
I was just seeing you're putting all the classes and then you're also putting all the methods in the show.
I was going to do like one or two. So when the thing
These
that
are install methods, sorry.
yeah, these are all methods for. So these are fields for the show, and these are methods for the show.
Okay, sorry.
No, that's okay. Because really what I want when you do your assignment is to look at the different things and think of what the objects would be, come up with a list of fields and a list of methods for them. It isn't going to be absolute and we can look at them and get more, but it'll give us something to at least give us a discussion point. This is actually really hard to do in some ways, to think about things in an object and to think about, one of the things is that you wouldn't want a show to be able to add a show, right? A show can't add itself. That's something a venue would have to do. To keep these sort of self-contained is difficult. But each class should be about one thing, and all the methods and all the fields should be about that thing, right? And it shouldn't have any dependencies. Inheritance creates some dependencies, but generally, other than through inheritance, you should avoid dependencies. And some people argue you shouldn't use inheritance much either. So, basically I'm saying you'd have to add an artist because you'd want to be able to add an artist to a show, right? So in the show, now it's actually a question. Maybe in the show, rather than the show adding the artist, that should be in the venue. What do you think? That the venue adds the artist to the show.
Right.
Yeah. I think you still might need the method there, though. The venue would call the add artist and do it. I'm not sure. As I said, this stuff can be a little hard to figure out where things go. I'm going to just put a question mark by it. Because I think the venue creates the show, but that means they have to be able to add artists to the show. And on the same
Create a show.
the same thing would be for like, and the genre could be more than one genre, I suppose.
Yeah.
Which would make it an array. They would have sets and gets for all of these. The only thing is for a list like artist or like genre, they might have. You would also probably have like remove artist. What? Say again. It means that the method doesn't return a value. So methods are two kinds. They return a value or they don't. If they don't return a value, they just do what they do and then they're done. So basically what this would do, it would add the artist and it would be done. Now you could do like, a lot of people prefer like doing int so that it returns a number if it succeeds. You know, again, one, like the stored procedures that I do, they automatically return 1 if they succeed, -1 if they fail. So you could do that, but typically void just means it does what it does and it's done. If you were doing like a function like square root, it returns a number, right? So then it would have a number like decimal or something here instead of void. Does that make sense? Python doesn't really specify void. You have to return. Yeah. Trying to think. You got to have functions that don't do anything. I mean, don't return anything.
Just print it out and For Python, right?
Yeah, you could just do print or something. I don't think it has to. I think the difference is whether you have a return statement or not.
Most really like Java and.
Yeah, well, Python is, it's a very popular language right now. But it's not my favorite language. It's certainly not a good object-oriented language.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a good, it's actually kind of like,
High demand right now.
it's a little like C++ in that it's a hybrid between a structured programming language and a object. You can do objects, but they make it so hard to do objects that you might as well not. Anyway, so is there anything? So I've added artists, removed artists. You probably could do the same thing for, there'd be sets and gets for all the times. You might want to do add and removes for the anything that's in a for anything that's an array.
It doesn't add fun.
What?
If you are registering to the show, do we have a method called
So what you would want, I'm assuming, and you guys don't have to write these out when you do your own. I'm assuming that there would be a set and a get for the show name, and a set and a get for description, and a set and a get for restrictions. You might have to do like an add and remove for genre. And ticket availability would be just a set and a get. I'm not doing the sets and gets just because it would make it really long, and you can kind of assume those. But if you don't want to assume those, you're welcome to add your sets and gets. I'm just trying to think of what other methods. Is there anything beyond adding and removing artists and things like that that would be part of this for a show?
About the restrictions.
I think just a set and a get on that would work, but I don't know. What do you mean?
Yeah.
What? So it returns an announcement. So I suppose they could have sent an announcement. Well, so when you create the announcement, it depends on what you're going to do with it. Because you could put in something like send announcement. Because it is possible to write code that would just put a send out emails, right? Or it could just place it on a web page. So it depends. This would be sufficient probably if what we were going to do is just put the announcement on the web page. But if you're going to do emails, you might want an actual method that does just that takes the announcements and passes them out. You'd have to figure out who the emails were. That could be really complicated, but one of the things about, like when you pass these overseas and things, this tells you kind of what the methods are, tells you what they have to return. You know, boy, we didn't do this, but if we did, and if you had the data types here, it doesn't tell you how to write what's in here, right? It doesn't tell you how to put the content in here. So when you send these diagrams over to India, they have to figure out the content for these methods. They know what it has to return. They know what it's supposed to do. They have to come up with the content for those methods, which is where the real heart of the coding is in a lot of ways. But as long, yeah.
Do we have reviews attached to shows?
So one of the things that I would do in a review, so here's the thing. Would the shows be attached, would reviews be attached to the show, or the shows attached to the review?
Shows attached to the review.
show attached to the
So with the review, so actually I could see it both ways. I could see a show having a collection of reviews, and I could see a review depends. There's a part of me that thinks it might be actually better to do reviews, even though they won't exist for a while. And I'm not sure. See, these are things you could think about. It might go over here, or it might go now, because a review could be its own thing separate from that. But you might want to bundle the reviews with the show that you're reviewing. And I think you could argue that it belongs to the show. Show is turning out to be quite complicated. But
And wouldn't there be different types of shows for like individual artists?
it might be, although this is abstract. It actually shouldn't matter here whether it's one artist or an individual. You know, this has a list of artists. And it could be a list of artists that has one item. What in here would be different if it was just one artist? These things, again, they're arrays, but they could be arrays that have only one item. The reason to make them an array is that then you can use it for one artist or many artists without having two different classes. Does that make sense?
Like if there's more than one artist in one show?
Well, there could be many artists in one show. So then you'd have an array of artists.
How about release date?
What?
Release date, director. Release date.
Release date.
That's like forever.
I think so.
Yeah, I wouldn't worry about the director.
Secret release date?
Maybe.
I'm thinking of this as just music. Music shows.
Okay, maybe so.
Live music shows. We don't have a complete list here, but there's the idea kind of there. And again, right now I'm not worried about you connecting them. We're going to show, like obviously there are connections here between show and artist, right? There's a relationship there that's sort of implied because we have a list of them. Same with shows and reviews. Venues, there's obviously a relationship between venue and that. There would be a relationship between probably between fan and artist, and then artist and show. So there's a lot, and so all of these are related, but I'm not worried about the relationships right now. We'll talk about those more later. If we looked at again, there could be a lot more methods here. Let's look at the assignment. That's because I was looking for venues. I mean, not venues. I was looking for hosts. So there is a thing on class. There's some other, these are just informational. But let's look at the group one for objects. And for today, you're welcome to start on this, or I will give you time on Thursday. I just don't know how you can do with the heat here if you want. So create a class diagram for all the elements that you think for community assist, right? So basically kind of like what we were doing with that, except I didn't finish it. This could take a while. And as I said, you can have some time, particularly Thursday. Rest of today too. But what are the class diagrams for every domain object? And what that means is don't worry so much about like the web pages, the views. Think about the stuff that would be manipulating the data, the core objects. Try to think of what the fields would be. What I want to do is get a good list of fields and methods, and we can just talk about them after the fact because as I said, this stuff is kind of hard to get a hang of, and it's real easy to bundle things together that maybe don't belong together. or that they do, and it isn't. It's also like a lot of things. It's not. There isn't an absolute right answer. There's a lot of room for discussion and argument. Try to add some methods. Actually, adding methods is harder than adding fields. Figuring out what the class should do. And then we haven't talked about encapsulation and abstraction, so maybe I should think about that real quickly. Basically, encapsulation, each class should be about one thing. And abstraction is basically that it should be about a typical. So like when we're talking about show here, we're talking about a typical show. It isn't this show. It isn't, I don't know any current artists. I do, but they wouldn't be here. So it's not like Pearl Jam's coming to soon, right? It's coming to, I think, to the CenturyLink. So we're not talking about Pearl Jam here particularly. We're talking about any show. That's abstraction, right? When in the database, or not in the database, but if you were doing this where you added a particular show, you made an instance of the show where it had its, you actually gave it a name. I have no idea what they're calling their show, but say Pearl Jam is the artist, and maybe the show is with Pearl Jam. You know, they then that would be an instance. But the class itself is abstract. It's supposed to be typical of any show. Abstraction has other meanings in object-oriented things. There's basically one of the meanings of it is that you should never repeat any fields across classes. Basically, if you find that fields are repeating across classes, you want to put them into a parent class. We'll talk about that more when we do inheritance. But that's what it means by abstraction. And then encapsulation is that every class should really be about one thing. You don't want to try to create one class that encompasses the entire business model. Right? You want to break it up so that each class is responsible for one thing. That one thing can be a little complicated, but it still should be one logical thing. And there's no right or wrong here, because mostly we'll do the first take will be just to discuss it. All right, so you turn it in and we'll discuss it. Now, as I said, technically we have a half hour or so left, but it's up to you if you want to work in this heat. Not promising it'll be better on Thursday. It's hotter outside, but I'm not entirely sure that this has to do with, you know, I might be able to bring in a fan. Actually, that is a possibility. Though, in my experience, it only helps these people right here.
One of those little USB ones and put it in every station.
So Thursday we'll be open to work on this.
Since one of the members are missing,
Yeah, I think there are people missing. But
Yeah, I'm like, yes.
I might finish this out on my own and just post it.
Yeah.
So I've been freezing all winter. I should appreciate the heat, but I'd rather it was outside appreciating it, I guess.
My theory is I would rather put layers on because you can't change any layers.
Yeah.
oh yeah.
So I'm not gonna stay. I'm gonna take off.
Oh, you're
Okay. Perfect.
So there's a video of all of this, but I will If I have a chance, I'll try to edit it a little.